for joining in tonight. If any of y'all are college football fans, I really appreciate you hopping on to pregame the College Football National Championship with some talk about parks and recreation and how they can help our mental health. And some other trends related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just a brief introduction to myself. I'm a PhD student at North Carolina State University, and I study parks and recreation and conservation social science. So basically what that means is handing out surveys to people, talking to people, trying to understand um, sort of how people relate to the environment, how people think about the environment, and then also how the environment impacts us. And that's sort of what I'm focused on with this particular presentation. So the title of the presentation is How Parks Protect Our Mental Health and Well-Being. And we're going to use a case study of the COVID-19 pandemic, using a couple of my own studies to sort of talk about what some of these trends looked like, pulling from other studies as well, from other researchers who investigated these topics during the pandemic. And like Julia said, feel free, if you have any questions that pop up, please go ahead and ask them during the presentation, or you can save them for the end. I'm fine with either way. But with that, I will go ahead and get started. All right, so first of all, oops, I think I popped something up here. We're going to talk about the mental health benefits of parks during the pandemic. And sorry, I'm not used to Teams, so I might be having a little bit of technical difficulty. Oh, there we go. I want to start by asking you to reflect about your own experiences with the pandemic. Did you start a new hobby? I don't know about you, but I was totally not one of those people that started baking sourdough or learned how to knit or, so on and so forth. It was tough, right? But one thing that I did do is I got outside more. And I'd be willing to bet that many of you did as well. And I'd also be willing to bet that that helped a lot, right? I got into bird watching. That was one new thing that I did, right? And that was something that was a really nice distraction from a lot of the stresses of the pandemic, right? That feeling of being inside and isolated. And it was a safe activity that I could do with my friends and loved ones, right? So think about these experiences as we move forward and how they impacted your mental health. We know anecdotally, perhaps, that these changes took place. But in this study, we wanted to sort of confirm on a larger scale, the larger group of people, was this a trend that many Americans felt during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so I want to talk by getting a little bit of science jargon out of the way. The term that I'm going to use in this study is subjective well-being. So if I ever say this term, all you need to think of is mental health. So I'll try to just stick to mental health, but I might slip up and go back into researcher mode. If I do, just remember, subjective well-being is basically mental health. The way it's defined by the National Research Council is how people experience and evaluate their lives in specific domains and activities in their lives. So basically, from a subjective perspective, what do you think the quality of your life is, right? And this changes a lot in regard to specific events in our lives, one of which is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this study, we want to explore sort of how that changed and what were some of the factors that influenced these changes in subjective well-being. So thinking of subjective well-being in the context of the pandemic, we have these broader impacts of the pandemic that we can think of. And certainly this is nothing new to anybody. This is nothing groundbreaking, but we experience social isolation, right? Excuse me. Personal losses, right? Some of us lost loved ones, people who are very important to us. There were restrictions on travel, so you couldn't visit loved ones. For maybe long stretches of time, weren't able to visit people very close to you. Closures of businesses, so there were significant economic impacts, adding another layer of stress onto an already stressful situation for many. And so this leads to several potential issues. So we have declines in overall mental health as one potential outcome, right? And this is confirmed within scientific literature, right? Across the board, it seemed like no matter where you were in the world, mental health seemed to decline overall. But then you have severe impacts, some even expressing symptoms of PTSD as a result of the lockdown, anxiety, acute stress, and depression. So thinking about all of these impacts to mental health, once again, what is one thing that we know helps, right? We know this, right? We know this through science, but we also know this on a personal level. experience in nature or spending time outdoors, right? Not even just, you don't even have to think of it as walking through a forest or a pristine nature area. It can be at a basketball court, right? Spending time outdoors and in nature provides several benefits. And this is shown to us in the scientific literature, right? Um, Research shows that spending time outdoors can help with relief and restoration from stressors of life. Not only that, but resilience against stressors in the first place. And then obviously physical health benefits, right? And these are things that I'm sure many of y'all, once again, focusing in on those experiences that you had during the pandemic. Um, these were benefits that I'm sure you were able to derive from the pandemic. And so that being said, the objective of this particular study that I'm going to focus on that we did here at North Carolina State University, myself and a team of other researchers as well, was to explore changes in outdoor and nature-based recreation during the pandemic. So you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between outdoor and nature-based recreation? Great question. Not a huge difference, right? They're both occurring in the outdoors, but in this case, we focused on outdoor recreation as things that weren't particularly nature-based. So like I mentioned, playing basketball outdoors, playing sports outdoors, maybe taking a walk in your neighborhood. So these are things that are outdoor recreation, but they're not nature-based. Nature-based is more specifically occurring in natural environments. So you can think of things like hunting, fishing, kayaking, hiking in a more remote area. So for the purposes of the study, we sort of divided those two in order to see if one was more impactful than the other, right? Is there something about spending time in nature immersed environments that actually creates a larger impact compared to outdoor recreation in terms of preventing these changes in mental health? And so we also wanted to explore changes in subjective well-being. Remember, this is what I'm referring to for mental health during the pandemic. And then looking at those changes in recreation and mental health, try to examine the relationship between outdoor activity participation and mental health. So for those who increase their activity in outdoor recreation, what kind of impact was there to mental health? Did it help? Did it have no effect? And then conversely, for those who spent less time outdoors recreating, was there a negative effect, right? So these are the things that we really wanted to look at. And so for this, I won't get too into the weeds about the methods, but basically we sent out an online survey, right? So this is just a survey. You filled out many surveys in your life, right? Asking questions to about 2,000 or so adults from all across the United States on the internet. This was done in summer 2020. And basically for the purposes of the study, we asked people about their mental health before the pandemic and then during the pandemic, right? And then we asked people about their outdoor recreation participation before the pandemic and then also during the pandemic. And with that data, we were able to run statistical tests to see if these relationships were verified, right? And so just to provide some general results, overall well-being scores or mental health scores declined by 24%. So that's pretty significant, right? So people reported that overall, so this is across the whole sample, sort of everybody aggregated together, right? These well-being scores, these mental health scores declined by 24%. So that's massive, right? Not surprising. I'm sure that from our own experiences during the pandemic, but to see it in statistics, to see it verified by numbers is certainly something that's, at least for me, was a bit jarring, right? And we saw that these declines in well-being or mental health, another way to say it, reported by 59% of adults, and only 13% of adults reported increases in well-being. And assuredly, these were the folks who were baking loaves and loaves of sour bread during this time. And so looking at some of these results within the context of outdoor recreation. So I want to take a moment to describe this figure here, just to make sure that everybody can interpret what's going on. So we have the average activity score, which is basically on the y-axis, just talking about how much activity you spend outdoors. So like how much outdoor activity are you doing and how much nature-based activity are you doing? And then we have on the blue bar, that's before COVID, and then the orange bar is during COVID. So essentially what you're seeing in a nutshell is a 35% decrease in outdoor activity across the whole sample, and then a 33% decrease in nature-based activities across the whole sample. So in total, declines in outdoor activity, thinking about outdoor and nature-based altogether, was reported by 57% of adults. And increases only reported by 11. So um, I think maybe uh, us people who care about parks more, right? Who are more environmentally minded, we got out more, and we may think that everybody else had the same idea to get out in nature more, but the data suggests that that really wasn't the case, especially not during this initial phase of the pandemic, spring leading into summer in 2020. And declines in nature-based activities reported by 50% of adults, and increases only reported by 10. So very similar numbers, right? And just to summarize everything in the slide, pretty much people stop doing outdoor activities as much, and people stop doing nature-based activities as much. And we'll see why that's somewhat problematic in the coming slides. So what we found, and I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the particular test that we used, but we basically found using a regression model that participation in more outdoor and nature-based activities, so both outdoor and nature-based activities, buffered against negative changes in well-being. So you were less likely to experience the negative impacts to mental health of the pandemic if you did spend more time outdoors and more time in nature-based outdoor recreation. Um, and that's prior to the pandemic, right? So that's not even accounting for those during the pandemic. So if you did that existing prior to the pandemic, you had smaller declines in your mental health. But also, if you continued your participation in these activities, continuing to participate in outdoor and nature-based activities at a high enough level during the COVID-19 pandemic, this also buffered against negative changes in your subjective well-being, right? So obviously highlighting the importance of parks and protected areas and getting people outside during times like this. And so once again, this is set up in a similar way to the previous graphs that I showed you, but in this case on the y-axis we have mental health scores. And then we have changes in outdoor recreation and nature-based recreation. Once again, blue bar is before COVID, orange is after, except this time it's looking at mental health. So we'll start on the graph on the left, and if we'll look at those who decreased their outdoor activity participation, pretty significant drop in mental health scores. So this is just illustrating for you the trend that I described on the previous graph, right? If you did not change your outdoor activity, you maintained it at a steady level, you saw a much smaller drop in your mental health scores. And then if you increased, once again, you saw a much smaller drop in your mental health scores. And then we see a similar trend on the right in the graph with nature-based activity participation. Those who decreased their nature-based activity participation saw a pretty precipitous drop in their mental health scores. Those who didn't change or increased their nature-based activity participation saw smaller drops in their mental health scores. So this is huge, right? But it's not all. So there was a similar study conducted for children by one of my collaborators at NC State, who basically ran the same study, just for kids instead of adults this time. And very similar trends emerged. So in this case, they had outdoor play activities and outdoor family activities instead of one group for outdoor recreation activities like we had. But we do see the same trends, right? Declines in outdoor activity were reported by 52% of adolescents. And knowing how important these activities are for children, that's pretty staggering, right? Resulting in an overall 22% decrease in outdoor activity participation. 60% of adolescents reported participating in outdoor activity once a week or less, and 27% of adolescents participated once a month or less, right? And in an era when we're already seeing declines in adolescents' participation in nature-based and outdoor activities during the pandemic, you've got to think that this had a pretty significant impact on the mental health of children across the United States. And once again, we're talking about this graph where we have average activity on the y-axis and then these different types of activities. So during the pandemic, outdoor play activities dropped by 43%, nature-based activities dropped by 40%, and outdoor family activities dropped by 29%. And then looking at mental health scores, once again, so now we've got mental health scores on the y-axis. And we see a very similar trend to what we saw for adults. Children who decreased their outdoor play activities saw a pretty significant drop in their mental health scores. Those who did not change or increased saw either a smaller drop, or even in the case of increasing, saw a small increase in their subjective well-being scores or their mental health scores. And then we see a similar trend as well for nature-based participation. Those who decreased their nature-based activities, those children who did, saw a pretty significant drop in their mental health. And once again, those who did not change or increase their nature-based activity participation saw a very insignificant drop compared to those who decreased. We can also think about different types of groups, in this case, college students. So this is a study that was conducted by Dr. Larson, who is my advisor at North Carolina State University. He's a faculty member there. And he and his collaborators looked at NCSU students, right? So he found similar trends to what we've already seen with our national samples. 54% visited parks less often, and 18% only visited parks more often. And in this chart, the thing I want to focus on most is what we've got highlighted in red here. So those who mostly limited their outdoor recreation, who stopped doing outdoor recreation basically, or decreased their participation, were more likely to feel stress, were less likely to deal with problems well, and less likely to report that they had overall good or excellent health. So once again, we're seeing this pop up in multiple studies, and that's the thing about science, right? Once you find a result, you're not exactly convinced with maybe just one study, but when you replicate and you go over and over again, and you start to see these trends emerge in multiple different studies independently with different groups, you start to conclude that yes, these findings are very relevant and robust. And this is what we found across adults, children, college students, and then all throughout the scientific literature. It's just scoured with indications that those who spent more time outdoors had less mental health, negative mental health impacts during the pandemic. So the main takeaways from this part of the study is that participation in outdoor recreation, both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, buffered against changes in subjective well-being. And this was true for multiple groups, adults and adolescents. And we didn't focus on college students for changes, but certainly based on that last slide, you saw that this applies to college students as well. And then as a follow-up to that, parks and protected areas, based on these results, are an asset for protecting against declines in mental health during times of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know this because parks and protected areas are often key spaces for outdoor recreation and nature-based recreation, right? So the big implication here is that, I'd love to think that this is the last pandemic in my lifetime that we experience, or the last crisis that might create a surge in park visitation or mental health impacts, right? But I really think that's not the case. There are going to be more instances like the COVID-19 pandemic in the future. What they look like, I'm not sure, but what I do know is that we need to expand access to these spaces that can be used for outdoor recreation and nature-based recreation to help prevent these declines in mental health, especially for sensitive groups, right? Thinking about children with who we really want to protect against declines in mental health during a developmental phase, right? These spaces can be crucial interventions to help prevent that. And so we not only need to increase the amount of green space available for people to recreate, but access to it as well. So making sure that green space is accessible in all parts of cities, making sure that people have transportation that allows them to get to green spaces as well. I think these things will be key moving forward, and I really do hope to see some of this emerge as tangible policy in the future. And so now I'm going to shift into the second portion of the lecture, where I'm going to talk about trends in park visitation during the pandemic. So we know that people experience positive mental health benefits from being outdoors, and this is great. But this also led to surges in visitation to certain parks, right? And this creates impacts that maybe weren't anticipated because you couldn't predict the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to talk about some challenges for managers in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and parks and protected areas. So what you might be surprised to hear is that overall park use decreased during the pandemic. And if you still don't believe me at the end of this presentation, I won't blame you, because it seems kind of crazy, right? This picture is a great example. Um, Parks, at least from my experience, seem pretty crowded, right? If you went out to Umstead on a Saturday during the pandemic, or maybe any day during the pandemic, Lake Johnson, for instance, during the pandemic, you saw substantially increased visitation. And at least for me, being in Raleigh, I seem to see a lot of increased recreation. And even traveling too. Grandfather Mountain during the pandemic was pretty packed. Um, so why does every other metric state that there was a decrease in park use? I hope to dig into that and explain that a little bit as we go through this presentation, with the caveat that certainly I don't have a definitive answer, but I do have some data-informed potential answers. So first, let's dig into some Google Community Mobility Reports. And basically what this is, so yes, Google is tracking your phone data and your location data. And what they do with that data is they make that data aggregated and publicly available, right? So what they do is for a variety of different areas. They have parks listed on Google Maps, right? And they can find out using cell phone data how park use changed during the pandemic. So let's start at the bottom with the United States. Um, this is during March to April 2020, so really the beginning of that lockdown phase. Park use was down 16% in the United States. And then moving into June and July 2020, we saw a pretty rapid increase in park use. And then in NC, we see less decreases in park use, probably because of regional restrictions that weren't as strict as the general US. But once again, moving into June and July, we see this increase. So just to summarize, we see a general decline in park use at the beginning and then an increase. But I think that can be attributed to seasonality, right? Because when the summer comes around, people go out to parks anyways, and also reduction of lockdown measures, right? And so with this graph, without digging into it too much, is showing is basically a 10 to 30% reduction in park visits during the year of 2020. And look at this red dashed line. This is representing closures related to the pandemic, and then reopenings as well. So you see this deep sort of crevice where closures created a situation where people weren't able to access parks in many cases. But with reopenings, you see that it starts to shoot up, but it doesn't quite get up to the same level as in 2018 and 2019. So park use did rebound once things reopened and once summer came around. But at least according to the data we can see, and moving a little bit forward into, this goes up until August 2021, we see that this sort of up and down seasonality pattern continues, but not at the same level as in the past. And I actually don't have the data ran for now, basically for through 2020. I would expect that some of the data shows that parks are getting close to pre-COVID use again, but I'm not entirely sure of that, just to be completely transparent there. But at least coming out of the pandemic, we did see during the pandemic, we saw decreased park use, and then moving into the vaccination era where things became a little bit less restricted, we saw that park use still wasn't quite as high as prior to the pandemic. So what we did see, though, is shifting patterns in outdoor recreation, right? And I think this might explain why some parks experienced increases in recreationists. So these major activities, so this is basically retail data. So aggregating all the sales of equipment related to these types of activities from all across the United States. And cycling was up 23% during the pandemic. Paddle sports up 56% during the pandemic. And if you, like I, thought that it'd be a good idea to try and buy a kayak during the pandemic and couldn't find anything, you saw this firsthand, right? Huge demand for kayaks, canoes, and other related water equipment. A huge 51% increase in golfing equipment sales. Camping, 31% increase. Birdwatching, 22% increase. So people started doing new types of recreation activities. And kind of a sneak peek of what I'm going to talk about later is that I believe that these activities sent people to certain areas, right? You can only canoe and kayak in certain areas, such as national forests, national parks, maybe, or other recreation areas that allow for kayaking, right? Not something that you can do in a huge majority of local parks. I know you can, like at Lake Johnson, for instance, but these sorts of activities are certainly suited to certain parks and protected areas over others, um, and maybe not permitted in some parks and protected areas. So all of that to say that these changes in the way that people were recreating may have changed the destinations that people were going to and concentrating visitation in certain areas. So we saw other trends, right? Recreationists are going out alone more often. I certainly experienced this one. Spent more time alone in nature than before. Recreationists are staying closer to home. Um, 40 or basically half remaining within 2 miles of their home, based on one survey. And then urban residents were the most impacted, right? And this sort of makes sense. People with less access to green space in urban areas, certain urban areas, and less availability to get out to green space in rural areas as well during the pandemic. And so there was this big narrative during the pandemic of maybe this will be a good thing because more people are getting outdoors, or not a good thing in general, but there might be a good side effect of the pandemic, right? Um, that more people are getting outdoors. Um, and is this the result of, we knew that park visits in certain areas were increasing, but is this a result of the same people visiting more or new people visiting the same parks for the first time? Well, one survey of the general public, and this was done in September 2020 by, once again, my chair, Dr. Larson at NCSU, suggested that it's really the same people going over and over again, right? Not really a lot of new users. So if you look at this table, let's look at type of recreationist and we look at non-user. And then we go over to the right and we see in that highlighted red, used more. Only 1%. Only 1% of non-park users reported using parks more, whereas regular park users there at the bottom, 28% reported using parks more. So really, unfortunately, it seems like these were the same folks basically getting out and recreating more and more, and perhaps visiting areas more frequently. And also, it's important to consider that recreation shifting patterns sort of created major disparities, right? So once again, this is Google Community Mobility Reports. And park visits were 43% lower in areas with a majority people of color living in those areas. And so this data basically shows that starting in 2020, prior to the pandemic, you see these two lines. So this green one is majority people of color, and then this orange line is majority white areas, and then monthly park visits. And you can see that they're almost exactly the same, moving in unison with seasonality. And also moving in unison with parks closing due to the pandemic. However, as we move forward into the summer and into the fall of 2020, we see that these changes, these trends created a disparity, right? Park visits increased substantially for majority white areas and decreased for majority people of color areas. So this is problematic, right? Because we've talked about at the whole beginning of this lecture how important parks are to mental health and protecting it during the pandemic. However, the data suggests that this magnified some disparities in terms of access to parks, perhaps the distribution of parks, transportation to parks, that type of thing. And then this is just another GIS visual example showing some of the areas that were affected most by the pandemic in terms of park access. And so before COVID-19, we knew that Black and lower income residents were less likely to use parks. And during COVID, these disparities were magnified, unfortunately. And once again, really important to think of, because if we're thinking about social justice, it's not just about access to parks. This becomes a bigger issue when you think about access to mental health resources, right? And certainly our data suggests that it is that type of issue. And it's also important to realize that several of these impacts vary across space and time, right? And once again, I think that this is a result of recreation being concentrated in certain areas over others. So we can think about littering, overcrowding, many other types of impacts. And so this is a bit of an overwhelming chart, but I am going to take time to break it down. But basically what this is we conducted a study where we asked county and municipal parks, so basically local park directors, about their impacts during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we also asked state parks superintendents about impacts during the pandemic. And we compared several of these impacts. So for instance, we have feeding or disturbing wildlife, off-trail hiking, erosion, litter, just to give a few here. And we compared them, right? And so you can see in the blue, we have impacts stopped altogether or they lessened. No change is gray. And then more is this kind of deep orange bar. And basically what you see, the big takeaway from this is that overwhelmingly, it seems like state parks experienced larger impacts, at least reported by state parks. So looking here, litter, 77% of state park superintendents reported that litter increased during the pandemic. 42% reported overflowing trash cans. 65% reported cars parked illegally. So these issues were pervasive during the pandemic. And you can compare this to 28% for litter for county and local municipal parks, 24% overflowing trash cans for local parks, so on and so forth. And then we see the same thing for a lot of visitor impacts, or we can also call them social impacts. And these are things that we're thinking of like loud noise or music, drug use, vandalism of site property, ignoring park rules, right? And once again, we see this difference between the local parks and state parks, where 68% of state parks are reported overcrowding compared to only 26% of local parks. 62% of state parks reported ignoring park rules compared to only 24% of local parks. And you can kind of take it from there and see these different impacts and how they may have been different across different types of parks. And I do want to caveat that this is aggregated data and it's certainly not a trend that's set in stone. And to sort of illustrate that point, I do want to take a moment to say, you know, Lake Johnson certainly is a good example of a local park that experienced heavy visitation during the COVID-19 pandemic and probably experienced many of these challenges similar to state parks as well, right? It's not like all local parks experienced minimal impacts or all state parks experienced high impacts, but we do see these trends, right? These are describing the larger trends. So at this point, I do want to give Julia and Chris an opportunity if they'd be willing to share maybe some of these impacts that you may have experienced or some of the changes in visitation during the pandemic and how Lake Johnson sort of managed that huge spike in visitation and maybe some of these associated impacts as well, if y'all would be willing to speak to that for a little bit.
Sure, we can definitely speak to that. I'll get us started and then turn it over to Chris if he has anything else to add. With our park specifically, we did see significant increases in visitation to our parks. We have a car counter in one of our parking lots installed to kind of help us get a rough estimate of what our visitation looks like. And looking at that data and on a linear scale, we did see an increase roughly about the time that the stay-at-home order went in place for North Carolina and the county, of just seeing a large impact to, or a large increase in visitation. Again, the counter data was only coming off our parking lot located at the waterfront. So if you are familiar with Lake Johnson Park, you're probably familiar with that parking lot and the increased use of that parking lot compared to some of our other parking lots in the park. Anecdotally, we did have some staff there kind of during the shutdown, kind of helping, encouraging some of that messaging, since we were seeing such increase in visitation, of increasing that messaging of, you know, make sure you're social distancing, you know, showing people visually what does 6 feet look like, to kind of help with that. We also did see increases in use of, we have what's called a QR Fit Trail. So it's a hand-free exercise fitness trail along our natural surface trail that is starts off behind our Thomas Crowder Woodland Center, which is the park office, and does a loop around that section of the park on the unpaved section. And looking at some of the data with that, we did see a significant increase in that. So we were seeing more use of that trail. Off the top of my head, I can't speak to whether it was new use or repeat use, like you were talking earlier, Justin, is that the data was showing that we're not necessarily seeing a ton of new users, but more of repeat users. And so that is kind of interesting to see, because we do see quite a few people in the park even before the pandemic hit, as to not knowing whether or not the increase in visitation was due to new people coming to our park, since we are also a urban park, and a large urban park within the city of Raleigh, if that is more of a increase in visitation of new users coming to our park, or more people coming to visit more frequently, in that we are the closest park. We have a stay-at-home order, so they're at home more, so they can actually get out during their lunch break and walk around the park and be in the park. And so that was attributing to our increased visitation. Chris, did you have anything that you would like to add?
Sure. I can add a little bit of more detail about our visitation. So typical visitation for Lake Johnson Park any given year is between 400,000 to 600,000 visitors. During the late spring to early summer of 2020, towards the end of the stay-at-home order, and then right after the stay-at-home order lifted, we were seeing trends of our visitation topping 1 million for that fiscal year, from June 30th to July 1st, or July 1st to June 30th, got it backwards. And so we did see a significant increase in our visitation at the site. And then, speaking to the recreational increase, we developed an electronic registration system for our paddlers. And we did see exponential growth with amongst our paddlers that had their own craft or access to craft that they could bring to themselves, since we had suspended services as we reevaluated what we were able to offer. Typical visitation for our paddlers is 5 to 6 a week, and during that same period of time, late spring, early summer of 2020, we were seeing 20 to 30 people a day bringing their own craft to paddle on our lake.
Thank you, Chris and Julia, for sharing that additional information. And I think that ties in well to some of the stuff that I was discussing, right? So some of these contextual factors that might have led to certain parks having more visitation than others, and therefore maybe some more of these impacts, right? One of which is the ability to engage in certain activities. So you mentioned watercraft. Increases in users using watercraft and the capacity to use it at that particular park might have drawn in more visitors. The fact that Lake Johnson is an urban park surrounded by so much potential visitation is another contributing factor that I think may have played in there. And certainly Lake Johnson is a good example of one of those parks that might have been heavily impacted by contextual factors, and showing that these trends aren't uniform, right? It's not like all parks experience huge increases, and it's not like all parks experience huge increases in impacts associated as well. And it's certainly, very plausible that many parks experience huge increases in visitation, and they had the capacity, right? The infrastructure and the staffing, and the funding to help prevent a lot of those impacts associated with increased visitation, right? So none of this is cut and dry. And the whole point of this lecture, this part of the lecture at least, is to show that it's quite complex, right? And we can do our best as researchers to try and disentangle the information. But one thing that I think that the data points to inevitably for all of this is once again tying back to the issue that I talked about at the end of the previous slides. We need more space and more resources for recreation. Parks. Even if there's a general decrease in park use, we're going to have concentrated use in certain parks. And those parks, we need to be better, I think, moving forward about identifying parks with capacity, or I guess a higher likelihood of experiencing increased visitation during these times, and then finding ways to get these parks resources so that they're ready for such spikes in visitation. So main takeaways, sort of a recap of what I just said, but park use generally decreased, but it's not quite that simple, right? Some areas had huge spikes in visitation, and some were able to handle it better than others, right? Maybe due to staffing, funding, etc. Recreation patterns shifted. People started doing new stuff, but it was a lot of the same visitors coming out again. But it also didn't always have the same impact. Some groups based on race or economic class were impacted differently. And we need to think about that in the broader context of access to mental health resources, which, as shown in the literature, during the pandemic, parks were a mental health resource as well as a physical health resource. So this is certainly a major social justice issue as well. And then environmental and social impacts increased, but this varied by type of park. So generally, it seemed like state parks experienced more impact, likely as a result of having more visitation than local parks in general. But once again, I want to highlight that it's totally case by case, right? We can look at these general trends, but it's not like these are absolutes, as kind of illustrated by Lake Johnson. And then parks finally are an asset for protecting the mental health and physical well-being of people from all backgrounds, once again highlighting the need to increase funding, staffing, so on and so forth for these parks as we move forward. And once again, I really do hope that some of the policy starts to reflect the positive impacts of parks during these times of crises, and investment in that sort of green infrastructure will be made moving forward, especially as global pandemics only become more likely with the threat of climate change. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free again to throw them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. There should be a microphone icon somewhere towards the top of your screen. Again, ask your question out loud. To give you guys a chance to start, I'll throw it off. So has there continued long-term study now that we're kind of we just moved into 2003 with, COVID still having an impact and effect on us, and how have parks helped over the long term now that it's been, a couple of years since we first got hit with the COVID pandemic? Has there been more research into that, and kind of what are you seeing with that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think the first thing to touch on there is the fact that the pandemic really is ongoing, right? I've talked a lot in the past tense about the COVID-19 pandemic, mostly as a tool of sort of dividing this mentally in my head. The pandemic being this like 2020 to 2021 time period when it was the most severe and we didn't have vaccines and there were still lockdowns, right? But certainly an ongoing crisis that still affects us, that still takes away loved ones from us, that still limits some of our actions. So absolutely an ongoing issue. And to be completely transparent, I know that there is literature coming out that has looked at this data more longitudinally, right? So similar studies that have taken, and sorry, longitudinal meaning multiple points in time. So looking at mental health data before the pandemic and seeing how that's changed through multiple years to the present day. Personally, I haven't looked at that data yet, but it's something that I certainly plan to dig into. One thing that we do know is that parks, irrelevant of a pandemic or not, have always been assets for our mental health. I think that is just sort of magnified during pandemics, and I would assume, just completely guessing here, an educated guess based on the current research, is that parks are still crucial for our mental health, even if some of the most severe impacts of the pandemic have been reduced in severity. I think that absolutely parks are still assets for our mental health. And even when, all trace of COVID is gone, or it's just like a yearly flu type of thing, hopefully, finger crossed, one at some point in the future, parks will still be an asset for our mental health, irregardless of a pandemic. So great question.
All right, so there's been questions thrown in the chat, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer us, but have there been conversations about leveraging these findings in marketing for our parks? Have you heard of that being used in some of the parks that you studied?
For marketing, just to be clear, I guess I'd like a little bit more clarification on marketing parks, as in marketing individual parks, like saying, hey, look at the mental health benefits of Lake Johnson and get out here and experience it. Is that kind of the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so not that I'm aware of. So this study just was published not too long ago. I want to say 3 or so months. And part of the reason that I wanted to sign up for this lecture series was to sort of help get this research out. And so I would love to see that, honestly, if this research was sort of translated and into a document that was more communicatable than its current format in this like really austere scientific manuscript form that it's in now. I would love to get these results out there and make people more aware about the positive impacts of parks, right? Um, and that's something that could very well be going on right now, and I'm just not aware of it. I'm not sure if it's happening in Raleigh or in NC, but I'm sure people are becoming more aware of parks and using the mental health benefits as sort of a tool, as an education and marketing tool. So absolutely, that's a very good question.
So kind of a similar follow-up question. Is there a plan to use the data to educate others about the availability of parks to non-users?
So no current plan, but once again, I think I will echo a similar sentiment where I, as a researcher now, I'm only a PhD student coming into my third year. Um, I I am still learning ways to effectively communicate science, and how to make it more digestible, right? That's a goal of mine moving forward, is to try and figure out how to take these findings and make them understandable, and not only that, but to help convey the key findings, the importance of parks, and how they can be personally beneficial to individuals. So I work with the Recreation Resource Service at NC State. So that's actually that poses like an interesting thing that I might follow up on with the director there to see if there could be some communication with getting out to park users and sort of talking, or potential park users. I don't know exactly how you would access that segment of the population, but potential park users, if we could um, help people understand these huge positive impacts, that would be awesome. Maybe something through the extension service could tap into that a little bit, but yeah, you may have just inspired a follow-up study somewhere down the line. So thanks.
We have a third question. So do you have any specific recommendations for how Lake Johnson or other parks can respond if we are finding we're in a similar situation again?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert, and certainly not a park manager, right? But I can take my limited understanding of some of these park management situations from my courses that I've taken at NCSU, and try to apply them. But I think the biggest thing is something that I harped on a little bit earlier, which is making sure that parks have enough funding, making sure that parks have enough staffing, making sure that there's enough boots on the ground to sort of talk to people about these impacts, right? So what we call interpretation, having actual park officials or employees going out and talking to people, enforcing rules, but in a way that can educate people about park impacts, right? Um, I think those are some of the biggest things, but yeah, just educating people about overcrowding, trying to get people to go to alternative destinations. So if there's, I don't know, I'm just making up a number, but if there's 20,000 people in Umstead one weekend, can we get some of those folks to head to Raven Rock, or somewhere else a little bit out of town, to Eno River, right? How do we sort of disperse use during future times of crises? And part of that is, creating more green space. Um, and a lot of this is complicated because it's tied into policy and funding, and getting people with money to spend it on green space. And one of the biggest challenges as a parks and recreation professional, and something I tell my students, is that you have to learn to communicate the benefits of parks to people with money and get them to see that value. So I think that's absolutely crucial moving forward. And if I can find a way to take these findings and get them into the hands of folks with power and influence, I'd absolutely love to do that. So another great question.
So one thing I'll kind of add, since some of these questions seem along the same ways, for me, this was very fascinating to hear this, especially being at a very popular park, both before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and as the pandemic seems to be making its way through the years. But it is something I was mentioning to Justin that I would love to pass this on, of our chain of command, to try to get it to those higher level staff. But again, it comes down to, getting, and Justin said that's something that he wants to work on, is getting these scientific findings into a way that makes sense to the everyday person. This was great. This was very eye-opening for me, and I think there are some great points, and like that I thought that, we're busy. It's, a bunch of new users, a bunch of people coming out, and, per your findings, that's not really the case everywhere. And I was curious too with your findings between your municipal and I think it was county parks versus your state parks, is your sample size. Were they of comparable size? Was one sample size bigger than the other that might influence it? And then knowing too, a lot of the state parks were kind of shut down for a period,
Yeah.
is whether or not you see some of that having an impact of why they were feeling some of these impacts with like overcrowding. Because I know for Lake Johnson specifically, while a lot of it was closed off, the actual park grounds were always open to the public. So people could come regardless of whether or not there was staff there. Whereas a lot of our state parks are gated and you couldn't access it until they reopened.
Yeah, great points. So to answer the first part of that question, our sample size for local parks, a combination of county and municipal, was about 100. And I believe there's about 246 in the entire state of North Carolina. And that reflects about bad at mental math, but I want to say that was around 40% of total parks, 39 or 40% of county and municipal parks. So in science, we have something called non-response bias. So we hope that we're not only getting data from a biased set of park directors. Park directors, we don't know what the bias might be. Not bias in the sense of you think of like racial bias, but you think of biased answers to survey responses, right? So in a nutshell, basically, just to put it in simple terms, we worry that the respondents that we got from a small sample might be answering in specific biased ways. Thankfully, it wasn't a concern for state parks because we pretty much got all of them. I think we were only missing like 5 out of the entire. I think there's like 43 state parks and natural areas or something like that, somewhere around that number in North Carolina. So we got most of them. But that's something that we don't know. We compared the number of urban and rural departments to urban and rural, the total urban and rural out of our samples, urban and rural parks versus the total sample, and they were exactly the same. So there was no bias in terms of how many urban and rural parks that we had in our sample. So that was promising to see. But that's a great point and something that should be definitely considered in terms of differences between these two samples. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to, so your second part of your question was about closures of state parks. So at the time that we collected this data, both local parks and state parks had reopened. But I think you make an interesting point about the fact that this was sort of in the wake of reopening, right? So people who were maybe clamoring to get out to state parks, who had been visiting some of these other parks or maybe not going at all, suddenly visitation exploded for many of these state park areas, which may have created some of these impacts that we see versus local parks, which maybe had their impacts more distributed equally across time. State parks sort of had this more condensed or sudden spike that could have created more of these impacts as well. And that's something we discuss. We're working on a manuscript for this right now, and that's something that we discuss as a potential limitation, right? A potential confounding factor that might be overblowing a little bit of this difference in magnitude between local and state parks. So absolutely, really good points on both of those.
And then you mentioned that for your local parks, you were talking to directors. I'm assuming it was departmental directors. You think you would have gotten a different response talking to the site management? So thinking with the city of Raleigh, there's a number of parks within the city of Raleigh. So if you were to talk to each and I realize that being able to do that is sometimes becomes a little bit more than it can do. Do you think you would have gotten a different response had you talked to the people that are at the site? And again, not knowing as much in how state parks are structured, I'm assuming you were talking to more of the site type people versus somebody that's overseeing multiple parks, especially if you're larger municipalities versus some of your smaller ones.
Right. So in the case of state parks, we got surveys from superintendents. And when we were talking to local parks, county and municipal, we asked the I'm so sorry, department. I'm forgetting the name of the head honcho, so to speak. Sorry, it's a bit late on a Monday night, so you have to forgive me. Department head, I guess. Basically, of the Parks and Rec department. And so basically whoever's on top, right? Director. There we go. That's the word. Parks and Recreation director. We're asking them basically, what is this like? And that's a really good point that in each case between the two parks, we're asking people who are at the top level of management within their jurisdictions. And I do think that biases the sample, right? So these are folks who are not necessarily out boots on the ground looking at these impacts day in and day out, right? They may be in some capacity, but I think in large part they're relying on reports and anecdotal evidence from their employees. And so when that information gets filtered up to the top, inevitably it could be biased or inaccurate, right? This is another limitation of our study as well. So yeah, I think that's probably the main concern there. I would hope my optimism is that these folks in charge know what's going on in their parks pretty well. So that's my argument in the paper. But yeah, great point to consider that as well.
Thank you. So we're reaching the end. I just want to make sure everyone that has questions has the opportunity to ask their questions before we wrap things up. Well, if nobody else has any questions, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you join us again in February for our next lecture. At this time, we do not have a speaker lined up, but as that gets updated, we'll update our website for you to be able to register in the same place you registered for this one. It does look like we have a raised hand for Shauna. I believe that's how you pronounce your name. If you want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to speak out loud.
Thanks. Since you're talking about the future lecture topics, I noticed that the ghost fireflies was making a comeback. Is that kind of a repeat, or is that a new follow-up topic to what was already discussed?
Sure. So it's going to be a bit of both. So it's going to be in preparation for the ghost firefly surveying that they mentioned last year's thing, as well as I believe they're going to give us kind of an update on what they've learned over the last year. If you'd like, I can always follow up with them and get a little bit more details of whether or not it's going to be the exact same presentation or if it's going to be different or not for that March topic. But it will be the Ghost Firefly team presenting again. And I believe they'll be providing some update on their information. But again, some of that information will be the same as last year's.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
And I just wanted to say before everyone logs off, thanks so much for taking time out of your Monday night to listen to me yammer on about parks. I do appreciate it. If you're watching some football, I hope you have a wonderful night enjoying the college football game. And feel free to follow up over email if you have any additional questions. I forgot to put it in the presentation, but my email is jmbeall, that's just my last name, @ncsu.edu. And I'd be happy to follow up over email and chat. So thanks so much. I really do appreciate it.
Again, thank you everyone for joining. If you are listening in tonight for EE credit, I will send out that form either later this week or early next week with the hopefully recording for this presentation for anyone that was unable to attend or wishes to share it along to others. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you have a great evening. Justin, thank you again. This was great. It was super interesting. I learned a lot. Have a great night, everyone.